Welcome, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you are here, that we're going to spend almost the next hour together. And we are going to spend our time really thinking about the values that we have and how do we take action in our communities that live those values so that who we say we are and who we want to be actually shows up in what we do. And so you want something to write or draw with. And once you have your piece of paper, I want you to divide it into 3 sections. And in each section, write one value that you have. And a value, there are different ways to think about what a value is, but think of a value as something that you find important. It could be a characteristic, like you care when somebody and you value when somebody has empathy or is kind, maybe a funny is a value that you have. You value funny and when people laugh. But a value might be something that you really care about. It might be a physical thing that you have. It could be time that you spend with people. So I'd like you to get a sheet of paper and I'd like you to divide it into 3 sections. And in each section, write one value that you have. So we're going to give you a moment to do that. And it's okay to use a scrap piece of paper. Doesn't always have to be a new sheet of paper. We can use a scrap piece of paper. And I invite you to think of what are 3 things that you value. So I'm going to put myself on mute so that you can take some time, and we'll give you, let's say, 3 minutes to think of 3 things that you value. Have fun. So like all of our times together, we want to make sure that we start in a good way. And so we're going to start with our land acknowledgement. And because you are all coming from different places, different territories, we're going to have a land acknowledgement that says that, so that we recognize and we can think of the land that we are each on. And so I would like to acknowledge that we are being hosted on distinct and diverse traditional territories of the First Nations and Métis where we live. At I Think, we are lands that are governed by the dish with one spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. The idea is that we can all peacefully live together in sharing this one dish, this land, and all that it provides, so long as we are mindful of only taking what we need. We recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And as we think about our land acknowledgement, there is a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's an Indigenous woman. She wrote a remarkable book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And one of the things that she says in her book is this: to love a place is not enough. We must find ways to heal it. That we can love our schools, we can love the different communities that we're a part of, but we're here together, and the work that you're doing for your school is so important because the last 3 years have been really hard. And we're going to have to figure out what are the actions that your schools can take. This is what work you're thinking about, is what actions can their schools take to heal the community, to rebuild it, to have it be something that is shining again. And so we thought it would be a really nice way today to start with Robin's words too, because as we talk to our guest today, she's going to talk about how in her organization, they have values and they take action. So there's action associated with our love, and there's action associated with who we want to be. And so I'd like us to remember that when we talk about community together, it's not just about coming together. It's not about being in the same place. But it's actually, communities are a place where people know that they belong and are affirmed in all their identities, but also where we do that for other people. So other people help us know that we belong and that who we are beautiful, wonderful things in all the parts of us, and that we do that for others. And so that's why I wanted to start our time. And I'd like to introduce you to our guest. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to start by introducing our guest in a hopefully a really fun way, an interesting way. And to all of our teacher friends, as you are doing this, you can make it so that when you look at the screen, you don't see all of us the same size, but you can actually have the person speaking as the biggest one on your screen by going to the view and doing speaker view. And so by doing that, what you actually get to do is see the person speaking the biggest. And that's always a good thing because then we can see them. And so I'd like to introduce everybody to Andrea. Andrea comes from an awesome organization called FoodShare that she's going to tell you all about. And I love FoodShare. I've heard of FoodShare for many years now, and I always hear about the very cool things that they're doing in my community, one of them, which is Toronto. And so what I wanted to do is we're going to start by having Andrea introduce herself. I'm going to ask her a series of questions, and then she is going to tell you more about FoodShare. And after that, you'll have time to ask questions of Andrea and the work that they do at this awesome organization. But we want to start by learning about you, Andrea, since we're going to spend this hour with you. And we know our names can hold stories. Sometimes the stories of our names are happy stories. Sometimes they're funny stories. Sometimes they can be heavier stories and we don't have to share them. But I asked Andrea before today if she would be okay sharing the story of her name, and she said yes. And so Andrea, can you tell us the story of your name?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because I often ask people the story of their names with that caveat that, if you don't want to share. And I often think, I don't know if mine is that interesting. And so I hesitated. I almost said like, oh, don't ask me that. So I called my mom to kind of ask some more questions about my name because it's not like a lot of people, it's not a family name. It's not something they decided on, because it had a lot of meaning. It was just, it was the 80s and it was popular and they thought it was cool. But one thing that my mom and dad did when they were sort of choosing my name, my mom really wanted one. They debated Danielle and Samantha, and then Andrea. They wanted one that could have a kind of fun nickname like Danny or Sam or Andy. And that was sort of it. But then they also did a rundown of, did they know anybody else named Andrea? And they were kind of doing an assessment of who else. So Andrea Martin, which probably most folks watching, some of your teachers probably know who that is, was on the Second City. Sorry for my dog. She will get excited a couple times probably during my presentation. One sec. And so I asked, like, who are some of those other Andreas? So Andrea from the Second City, there was somebody named Andrea on the news, but my mom also remembered that she went to high school with somebody named Andrea, who was really popular and athletic. And, my mom was, she says, not those things. She was in the band, which awesome people are in the band. But she kind of self-identified as somebody who didn't necessarily have a lot of friends. And actually, she did get bullied pretty badly in school. But Andrea was somebody who was always really, really cool and nice to her. And so I was proud. And that actually was a story that until I asked about it, I didn't know as much about. So yeah, thanks for encouraging me to do that little bit of family research about my name.
When we talked about our values at the beginning, it's really nice to know that you were named after somebody who has the values that you also care about. So somebody who was nice. And so that's so awesome. And we're glad that our time together allowed you to ask those questions and find out a very cool story. And so maybe the next question is, can you tell us about a community that you feel that you belong to?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. I thought about this a lot because I think you acknowledged earlier with Toronto being one of your communities, because I'm part of a lot of them, it just by nature of being out in the world. But one that really struck me in terms of one that makes me feel like I belong is a gym community that I'm part of. And it's not exclusively for, and everyone is welcome, but most people who are in my gym community are fat. And as a fat person who in a lot had always been very much intimidated by gym culture and working out, even though I'd always been really interested in it. I loved to exercise. I'd always been pretty fit and strong, but bodies like mine didn't always feel welcome in more traditional working out environments. And I don't know whether that's because of who I am and my body, or just because maybe gym cultures in general aren't friendly, warm, welcoming places. I didn't necessarily see people talking to each other in the locker room or making connections or making friends. It seemed like this really solitary endeavor. And I'm kind of I'm chatty, I'm a people person. And so I really loved joining a community where people had, a shared sense that they were there to work out and to get stronger and to feel good, but also, hopefully to make some friends. So yeah.
And so tell us about a time or one action that this community takes to help you feel like you belong in this community. You're on mute. Oh.
Yeah, I was just asking my cousin and roommate nicely to use another room while I was doing this presentation. This is the work from home life. I'm trying to think of just one thing that that community does. I think ultimately just existing, like the fact that somebody in this case the person who is our trainer was Miss Plus Canada some years ago and wanted to kind of work out and get in shape and feel good about her body, and she didn't have a gym that she could go to, and so she started one. And so to me, the fact that she took that initiative, built the space, and she often will reflect and say, like, it's grown to be so much bigger than her and so much beyond what she initially intended. But yeah, just having a space that we can collectively sweat in and get stronger, and just be around people who kind of understand where we're coming from. I think that to me is the most meaningful way of feeling like I belong there.
And what is one action that you take to help members of the community feel like they belong in this gym?
Um, I I was thinking about this earlier. I don't know how many folks who are watching have seen the movie Mean Girls, but there's a kind of running thread in there of people saying at the lunch table, like, you can't sit with us. And I've always endeavored to be somebody who serves like the opposite energy. I always say I have you can sit with us energy of just like make the table bigger, make the circle bigger. And so I really try and do that because I remember those like lonely locker rooms, because I remember being like, why does nobody smile? Why does nobody say hi? And so whenever I see that somebody's a new member, maybe I can tell they're coming to class for the first time, or they're on their, or anybody who's just on their own, I just kind of try and chat them up, see how they're doing, crack some jokes and whatever. And I guess another way is that we have these mirror markers where we'll put just little celebrations, little achievements up on the mirrors in the gym. And so it might be like the first time somebody does, instead of a crunch, they're able to do a full sit up, or first time they achieve like a 1 minute or a 2 minute plank. And so, yeah, I really made it a mental note to be the person who goes and grabs those mirror markers and puts up somebody else's achievement, because people often don't want to brag, but I'm happy to brag for them and really, celebrate that they've done something new and that they're proud of. So yeah, I think just getting behind other people's achievements, big and small, is something that I try and do to be welcoming and create as best as I can a sense of belonging.
You point to something so important, which is helping people feel like they belong sometimes requires really big things, but sometimes we can think about the little things we need to do, like giving people permission to celebrate success. Like when we do something new, when we try something new, when we've achieved something that we've set out is important to us. So it's not about me comparing myself, but rather I did something that I thought was important for me, and having you be like, no, this is great. This is amazing. It's not about other people. This is why we are having these conversations about community, that there are just so many ways that we can build a really wonderful community. And so thank you for sharing about your gym community. Thank you for sharing about the ways that they welcome you and help you belong, and that you do that for them. And so we're going to have Andrea share about where she works, but we're talking about where she works in a really special way, which is not just what they do, but what does the organization believe, and how do they live those beliefs? And that's what we're going to call values, right? What do they believe matters, and how does that show up? Because one of the things, as you're all thinking about your school communities, is what does it mean to be a community? What do we care about? And we can't just say we're going to be welcoming. We can't just say we're going to celebrate. We can't just say we're going to embrace diversity and many different kinds of people. We have to act in those ways. And the reason we asked FoodShare to come and Andrea to come is that FoodShare does an incredible job of making sometimes really hard choices to make sure that the way they want to see the world and what they believe in shows up in how they act. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Andrea. She's going to tell us about what they do at FoodShare and how they do it. And after that, you're going to have some time to talk with each other about what you found interesting and what questions you have for Andrea. So I'm going to hand the floor back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just tell you a little bit about FoodShare. And one thing I will start right off the bat is that we do, in terms of activities, all kinds of things. A lot of nonprofit organizations have a really specific, set of programs, and it can be quite easy to discuss. But I really liked the opportunity to come here and talk about our values, because that is probably the thing that holds it all together. So some of the stuff we do consistently, and we've done for 15 years. Sometimes we just do little small projects, or we get involved in something. So it can often feel like, wow, what's FoodShare? What are they up to? How did they get involved in this? But really, it's all held together by our values. So going to my first slide, and to just tell you, in a little bit more detail, that FoodShare is a food justice organization. And what that actually means is that we advocate for the right to food, and that we work to challenge the systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the food they need to thrive. So we don't look like a lot of other organizations that are doing important work around urgent and emergency food, who are making sure people have the food they need now. We're trying to look a few steps ahead and say, why is it that we don't all have access to the food that we need? And what steps can we take? What policies need to change? What parts of our culture need to change? What kind of understandings do we need to create so that people can actually, on an individual level, have the food that they need? And we do that in, like, I'll only probably touch on some of the things we do, but we do that in all kinds of ways. But whether it's the urban farms in the city that we work with, whether it's about produce markets, where we make sure that the produce that's for sale there is as affordable as possible, so we actually take on some of those costs, or whether it's doing like learning programs and community kitchens with folks so they get to like learn and cook together. But all of that is actually grounded in wanting people to access food that they need, but also food that they want on their own terms. So nobody providing it to them, nobody telling them what they should eat, nobody limiting, what they should eat, but everybody getting, access to the food. And we know that that's not the world that we live in. And so very much trying to future build and think about building a better world, and one where we do all have access to the food that we want and need. So our vision, which is on the next slide, excuse me, is a Toronto where all people can feed themselves, their loved ones, and their communities with dignity and with joy. And for a lot of organizations that do food security work, which is what it's called, FoodShare's kind of core work, food security, making sure people have regular access to food, it's often grounded just in the dignity piece, just that it's a right and people should have food. But we always want to take it a step further and say, we also know that food's a real source of fun. It's a source of connection. It's a source of often community building, right? So often when we think of, when did I last have a good time? It's often a time that I was together with friends or family or neighbors, and we were eating together and we were sharing food. And so really never discounting the balance. And so we often in our work almost think about that at a scale in our head. Are we balancing, that dignity and that joy in everything that we do? And my next slide talks a little bit more into the discussion of our programs and what we do. Oh yeah, and I just put in that picture to say that's us, just saying hi. That's the FoodShare team. The next slide after that just is going to talk about our programs. There we go. And then that's just to give you an idea of all four, but then I'll take us through just the four sections. There's a photo for each one. So the first one is community food growing. And so I don't know about everybody who's here with us today, but for me, and I mean, I actually grew up in kind of not quite a rural area, but a small town with farms all around. I always thought of growing and farming as something that had to happen like deep out in the countryside. And so one of the things that we do at FoodShare that still, and I've been here for, working here for a while and still kind of blows my mind and makes me really excited, is urban agriculture, growing food, fruit and vegetables right here in the city center. So my colleague Echo is in that photo. He's sorting out some tomatoes, and Echo, right kind of behind his head, I don't know if you see a whole bunch of cars and a big sign, that's the 401. That's the big highway running through the city. So we do gardens and farms on school grounds, in our school grown program, in community areas, in unused hydro corridors. So really thinking about, instead of feeling like our food needs to come from, far away, how can we actually produce food for ourselves right here in the city? So that's community food growing. We also, next slide, do something called community learning and engagement. And community learning and engagement, this team, I couldn't even begin. They could do a whole 15-minute presentation for you on their own, just about all the cool stuff they do. So I wouldn't even dare to try and cover it all. But I think that the real key to what they do is recognizing that nobody has zero knowledge about food. Even when we're, kindergarten students and we show up, we have foods that we already like. We might even have recipes that we know how to make. We already have a relationship with food. So how can they help people to really engage and learn more and get excited about the ways in which the food that we eat has a relationship to the world around us, whether it's thinking about who grows our food, and having more understanding, respect and care for many of the migrant farm workers who take care of a lot of the food that we end up, eating on our plates and when we go to restaurants, whether it's thinking about where our recipes come from and where certain foods come from and how that connects to the fact that, especially in a city like Toronto, we're a cultural mosaic of people from all around the world. And so that's just a little bit about what that team does. They do workshops, they do online programs. And in this photo, that's actually my colleagues, Ranu and Chris, and they're packing up some individual lunch bags that are going to get delivered all over the city so that people could actually continue to do cooking classes, even in the pandemic, on Zoom together. The next one is called Community Action Support. And we do this by, as very much as the name sounds, we actually work with existing programs. So FoodShare is, in some ways, we don't think of ourselves as a big organization, but we are a relatively big citywide organization. But in every corner of this city, in every neighborhood, there's awesome folks, community leaders. Some of you might be involved in food programming now. You might have, elders in your own life who are involved in that kind of thing. And sometimes it's just a few neighbors who get together and say, we want to start a neighborhood growing program, or we want to get something going here. And so we work to provide funding, training, support, whatever we can to keep those initiatives sustainable and keep them going. So one example in this photo is the team from the Scarborough Co-op Market, and the two founders are in the photo, and they were just a couple of neighbors. They met through climate justice actions in the area, and they thought, what, we don't live in a place where it's very easy for folks to get to a grocery store, and when they get to a grocery store, in a lot of cases, the fruit and vegetables are really expensive. So how can we bring a produce market into our neighborhood? And they just sat down and made a plan and came up with a budget and started applying for some grants, and they did it. So at FoodShare, we really love supporting those kinds of initiatives. And then the last one, which as a nonprofit organization, which means we technically, unlike a corporation, unlike a for-profit business, our objective is community service. It's not necessarily making money. At the same time, as a nonprofit organization, having to depend exclusively on government grants or for-profit corporations giving us money can make it really hard to be consistent about the things that we do, and in particular can make it really hard to be consistent about things like affording our rent for our building, or being able to consistently pay our staff and make commitments about wages and that kind of thing. So a few years ago, what used to be a community program called our Good Food Box program, we transitioned it into a social enterprise. So a social enterprise is when a nonprofit does something, but does charge money for it. And so you'll see my colleagues Nasir and Ben, and they're packing up boxes on the side. They say food is a right, something that's very important to us. And those are actually subscription boxes. So people come onto our website, they buy a box, they can buy one off, or they might subscribe to one every week. And we try and keep those as affordable as possible. My boss, Paul, will always say, we're not paying for anybody's vacation home or that kind of thing. We're not trying to make big dollars, but we are trying to keep it sustainable and keep fresh produce as accessible as possible to folks in the community. So that's FoodShare. That's what we do. And then I have a couple more slides really trying to think about the same thing that y'all were thinking about at the beginning when you were asking, hey, what are my values? And so when you're a whole organization, it actually takes a little more time than that. But funny enough, it kind of works the same way. We all get together in a room and we all get out our piece of paper or our laptop, and we start to think about what are the things that matter to us and how do we document them, and what are the things that we collectively believe in. And so these are what we came up with. These have been in place for about 2.5 years. At FoodShare, we believe that everyone has the right to food. We are equity oriented. We acknowledge the existence of various forms of systemic oppression, and we work to challenge them. The second part is really important. We believe that Black, Indigenous people and people of color and low-income communities play a central role in defining food justice and in its priorities. We recognize that leadership exists in community. I gave an example of the colleagues in Scarborough who started that market. We believe in prioritizing lived experience in addressing food insecurity. We believe that all bodies have a right to exist as they are. We are committed to self-examination and ongoing critical assessment of our work. And we ask our partners and our funders to engage in ongoing critical assessment of their work, so that we make sure that people that we are in community with, who are benefiting from our work, and when we are benefiting from theirs, that we all continue to do that, really, that reflection and taking those hard looks at ourselves and being willing to change what we did in the past, change how we used to do things. Taking an example of our body liberation and fat acceptance work around all bodies have the right to exist as they are. FoodShare as an organization absolutely used to be an organization that taught about good, healthy food versus, bad junk food, and talked about how much sugar was in things and talked about those kind of things. And we've made a very strong collective decision that that's not our place and we're not going to do that anymore. We're instead going to talk about the importance of everyone having access to the food they need and the right to make choices about what they put in their body. So yeah, that's just one example of that ongoing, self-assessment that we do. And then my last slide just is going to give you a little bit idea of, so we have those values and they matter and we talk about them, but how do they actually show up? So they show up most importantly in the work that we do in community. So across all our programs. So when you saw my colleague Echo there sorting the tomatoes, that farm not only employs young folks, for example, but it makes a priority of employing young folks who have historically been left out of agriculture, who haven't had the opportunity to work on farms. And it creates entrepreneurial opportunities so that instead of having to continue to work for someone else at a fixed wage, those folks are able to start their own small businesses, their own micro farms. And Echo and my colleague Kevin are actually one example. They started something called Earth Known Farm, and they sell these beautiful bouquets of flowers. That's just one example, but in every way that we design our programming, we try to make sure that those values that I noted in the previous slide are always coming up. It's true in the way that we do events, in who we give a platform to, in what we talk about, in what conversations we decide to bring to the public. It shows up in media anytime that we get interviewed on TV or the radio or in the newspaper. It shows up in the movement work that we support. So even though we're a food organization, we do a lot of advocacy work and a lot of support of organizations that are doing things that absolutely intersect with what we do. The most recent example is supporting some folks who run an organization called Decent Work and Health. And the decent work movement is all about making sure that people have a safe workplace. And so we're, absolutely throwing ourselves behind that important cause. It also shows up in petitions and stance taking. We just had a really, big, successful advocacy campaign happen, wrapped up about 2 weeks ago. We were actually able to push through collective action the City of Toronto to commit to drafting a new food charter in consultation with the communities most affected by food insecurity. And then the last one, and I think Noga has some questions for me, so I'll maybe talk about it a little more, but the last place that it shows up in is actually in our staff policies, in how we treat each other, and how FoodShare as an employer treats the staff, including myself, who work there. So thanks everyone for listening. That's a little bit about FoodShare.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give all our friends a moment, because you just learned a lot about this awesome organization, what they do, but how they name what they care about, how they name their values and who they want to be. And then that they actually act in that way. That, like we said before Andrea started talking, it's not about saying we want to be welcoming, or we want to have many people represented, or we want to support, but there are actions that go along with that. And so I'm going to give everybody in your class, you're going to have 3 minutes. I want you to turn to a partner and figure out what is one question that you have for Andrea. It can be about FoodShare, the organization. It could be about what they do or how they do it. And we're going to give you 3 minutes to talk to your neighbor. And then after that, please put your questions in the chat. And with your questions in the chat, we'll start having these conversations and hearing more from Andrea's. So with that, take your 3 minutes. Take another minute, and if you want to start putting questions in the chat, there's a Q&A and there is a chat piece. You can do it in either one, whichever one you'd like. And if you want to start putting some questions in the chat, and we'll give you one more moment to do that. I'll ask Andrea a question as you start telling us what you want to know about, and we will dive right in. Can't wait to hear what you want to learn about. Brilliant. We're going to get started. We already have at least one question in the chat. So we're going to jump right in. And maybe before I ask my question, Andrea, can you tell us about how FoodShare makes its money and where do you get funding from? Thank you to our class that asked that question, because maybe if I could add a second part to that piece is, why is it important that you have money consistently? You told us that you also have a social enterprise, and you started talking a little bit about that. So where do you get your money? How do you get funding? But why is it important that a place like FoodShare has money consistently?
Yeah, absolutely. So our how we get our money is sort of split about half and half between the social enterprise. So actually selling those subscription boxes, those weekly produce boxes, and we get the produce from there in two ways. Some of it we just procure, so we buy those things from local farms and from and as well from the Etobicoke Food Terminal during the off season. But we also do that through growing food on some of our own farms here in the city. So the farm that I showed you the picture of Echo on, that farm is 3 acres, but it produces about 25% of the fruit and veggies that go into the boxes that we provide during the summer months. And so that provides that is sort of self-fulfilling, that generates its own income. And then the other way, as with, I think probably most nonprofit organizations, it's a little bit of a patchwork between government grants. So those could come from the federal government, from the city, or from the province. In our case, most of that money, because we're a Toronto-based organization, comes from city government. So in other words, anybody who's living in Toronto and paying taxes in partly funds FoodShare and other nonprofit organizations. And then the last thing is two more things. One is large private donors. So that might be businesses, that might be foundations. And we get quite a big chunk of money every year from the United Way. And then the last, and kind of the one that's closest to my heart, just because it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about, what can we all do in big and small ways, is just individuals. And some people, when they're writing their will, they choose to leave, some money in their will to FoodShare. For some people, they make a big donation every holiday season. And for others, they actually are monthly donors. And we have people who are signed up to give, $2 and $5 a month, all the way up to, a few hundred, depending on what kind of money they have and what they earn. And so that's always really meaningful to us, because that's somebody who's actually looking at their own paycheck and saying, I value FoodShare's work enough that I'm going to commit to sending it over, some of it, to them. So yeah, that's the kind of breakdown of our funding sources.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you them all at once. Let's do these two first, which is FoodShare just in Toronto, or is it international? And do you know of other organizations maybe outside of where you work that do similar things? And then secondly, what do you do for FoodShare? What's your job? And how come you're here talking to us today? Out of all the people that you showed us these awesome photos for, why is it part of your job to come and share with us today? So we're going to answer those, and then I'll ask the next questions from that class.
For sure. So FoodShare, as a name, there are other organizations named FoodShare in the world, but we're not directly associated with them. So they might, because there's only a certain amount of names for organizations to go around, they might do the same thing or something similar. But FoodShare Toronto is its own independent entity. It actually goes back. It was funded by Mayor Art Eglinton in 1985. So it was actually initially an action of the Toronto City government, and then became independent and a nonprofit organization in about 1989. Excuse me. And so that is, but do I know of other organizations who do things like we do? Yes, absolutely. And we try to network as much as possible. My executive director, Paul Taylor, has actually spent a bit of time in the last few months going to Montreal, Halifax, and I think just Montreal and Halifax. And then I know he spent some time a couple of years ago in Vancouver meeting with other food security organizations who do work. And oftentimes that networking is really important, because we get ideas from each other and vice versa around policies, around ways to do things better or differently. We just started working and talking quite closely with an organization called Food Matters out of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba, because they were looking to introduce explicit values and an explicit food justice statement in the same way that we did. Because for a lot of organizations, that values and stuff is something that people keep behind the scenes. Partly, I think, because when you put your shingle out and you say, these are our values, people are going to hold you to them, right? It creates accountability. And we think that's a good thing, but it can be quite an intimidating thing as well. So yeah, we've been working with them on that. What do? I am the marketing and communications manager at FoodShare. So that means anytime that FoodShare is in the media, I don't usually talk to the media, my colleagues do, but I kind of am the one making all the appointments, doing all the scheduling and that kind of thing. If you visit our website, I'm in charge of our website, our social media. I work with a team. I don't do it all by myself, but my wonderful colleagues, Ray and Mo. But that's all part of my work. And then I also and the person who's the kind of touch point for a group of people we call, who are our spokespeople, who can go out and talk on behalf of FoodShare. And kind of as a nickname, but I'm thinking of making it more official, we call them our spokesfolks. So people who speak on behalf of FoodShare. I'm one of those people. So in terms of why me today, usually I would send around an opportunity to the group, and then we would see, based on who's available, that kind of thing. Full disclosure, it's actually concurrently a FoodShare staff meeting right now that I'll be going to a little late. So that was one of the reasons you got me. But the other reason is that when Noga and I met, I actually was just kind of learning about this opportunity and seeing who would be a good fit. But then as we talked about community and being part of one and everything else, I actually shared a little bit about my gym and some of the other things. And it was like, hey, I think I feel pretty strongly about this. I think I've got some things to share. So that's why I'm here. And then the last, oh, did you ask me this one yet about the farm?
No, I was actually going to pair it with another question because we're
Sure.
getting such great questions, if that's okay. I love these.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. The pandemic has been really hard and it's changed a lot of the ways that we work. And for some, it has also challenged how our values show up. Especially some of the values you have around community and voice and lived experiences. And so can you tell us about how the pandemic has affected FoodShare, both the people who use FoodShare, but also as an organization, how you live your values? And I want to tie that to this question of what happens to urban farms in the wintertime, and how does what you do with the urban farms in the winter, how does that align with the values that you have?
For sure, for sure. So in terms of how the pandemic affected FoodShare, that was mostly initially in just having to think about our staff safety and making sure that all our programs went online. Because at that time, FoodShare, even though we sell boxes and we actually sell some boxes to community organizations that do provide them free of charge to folks who are in need of food, we weren't actually providing any direct food aid. So we didn't have end users per se. We had people who were taking our courses or people who were taking part in our farms, and so we had to make sure we made all those programs virtual. But what did happen is the state of food insecurity in our city it deteriorated. Way more people didn't have enough to eat, and so we did, thankfully, because we have that infrastructure that we talked about earlier in terms of that community action support, because we're networked with all of those small community organizations throughout the city where people know that what their neighbors need and where they need it. We teamed up with those folks and we actually did manage to do a bunch of fundraising. We had an incredible amount of generosity from the whole Toronto community. We got some funding from the city, not enough, but we got we got a lot of generous donations, and we were able to provide boxes free of charge. And I think at last count, we called those the emergency good food boxes. And I think at last count, we provided about 2.5 million pounds of fresh fruit and vegetables free of charge, with no, what should I say? No strings attached, no requirements. People didn't have to provide, prove that they were on social assistance. They didn't have to provide any details about their economic, situation. It was, if you come to a community group and identify as somebody who's in need of a produce box, we're going to do our hardest work to make sure that you get one. So yeah, that was what the pandemic was. So it dramatically changed, our work and our workflow. When you see in the photo that I shared of my colleagues working in the warehouse packing boxes, those folks went from packing an average of 200 boxes a week to our paid subscribers to packing around 4,000 boxes a week. So yeah, an incredible growth. And so when you ask, how does that align with our values? It can be very, very easy as a nonprofit organization to focus only outside, only on the community members in need and not on your own staff. But we also had to check our values and say, we need to make sure that our staff are safe, that they're taken care of, that they have not only the physical safety that they need in terms of COVID prevention, but that they're also, making enough money to get by. So it was during the pandemic that we shifted from paying, we weren't ever paying at minimum wage. We were paying, slightly more than that, about $18 an hour, but we officially became a living wage employer during the pandemic, which means that there's an organization called the Living Wage Network of Ontario, and they are economists who do calculations as to what does it actually cost the average household to get by in a city like Toronto. And here in Toronto, that number is $22.08 an hour. So we shifted to becoming a living wage employer. And I'm really proud to say that now FoodShare actually pays everybody, from the day they start, $24 an hour, whether they work on our farm, whether they work on our warehouse, and so on. And those funds are capped based on the highest paid employees. So that also means that our executive director can never make more than 3 times what our entry-level staff make. So it really requires that leadership work hard to make things better for everybody, because they only win and gain and get increases if folks who are entry-level staff do as well.
It's incredible to hear that, because we often think of, how do we make things better? How do we keep improving? And, the idea that as an organization, you said at first, it's going to be more than minimum wage. And then as you were learning, and as we were learning about what it actually takes to live in Toronto and how much money we need to be at least comfortable, the continuous learning and continuously aligning the values, like it's never ending. And it's about always sort of checking in. And as our friends here are thinking about community and the community in their schools, it's what actions do we take, and how do we keep checking in that the actions you take to make your school a wonderful community are always doing what you're hoping they do. Right? That you're making sure that the way you welcome, the way you make people know that they belong today is also going to work next month and next year. And that we don't just take for granted that because we've made a change once, it's going to be okay forever. But that you keep taking that action as an organization is incredible. We're gonna end with one last question from one of our classrooms, which is, how do people that need to use FoodShare find you? And I'm going to expand that question a little bit, because I'm making an assumption, and maybe this wasn't what the class meant, but when I read the people that need FoodShare, I think of people who need food, and how do they find you? But also, how do people in society, like in the wider community, who, whether it's they want to participate in a cooking class, whether they want to learn more about organic farms and urban farming, how does the wider community find out about FoodShare, and how do you welcome them into your community, whether it's for one cooking class or people that you may help to feed and keep food on their table for the pandemic and beyond? And so can you tell us both about the people who might need access to food, but also the wider community?
For sure, for sure. And apologies to the folks who asked the question about the farms. I didn't mean to, so I did want to answer that as well, because I don't want to dodge that one. That's a good question, especially in a place like Toronto where we cannot farm all year as much as we might like to without greenhouses, which one of our partner farms at Black Creek Community Farm at Jane and Finch, they do have a greenhouse, so they're able to grow all year, which is amazing. And the stuff tastes really good that comes out of the greenhouse in the middle of winter, because it's like fresh and it's local. But we put those farms to bed, so they go into kind of hibernation over the winter. But speaking back to being consistent with our values and not creating precarious work. And when I say, just to make it the connection really clear between why we treat our staff a certain way and why we don't want to create precarious work, meaning people, contract to contract, bopping from job to job, is that puts those same people at risk of food insecurity. That makes it hard for them to feed themselves and their loved ones with dignity and joy. If we're employing people just for 3 or 4 months in the summer and then laying them off, and then they now, they don't have a regular income. So wherever possible, we try to create annual programming in our community food growing teams, so those people stay on and they work for us. They work right now, because of the pandemic, they work from home. We do different things. Sometimes it's building planters. There's different work that we always try, and just planning of the farms and doing the business planning about how can we grow, how can we do better, how can we be bigger, so that we can keep, growing food, good, fruit and vegetables that are going to go into those boxes. So we do try to not create, and that's not, and this is also about setting goals and always striving to meet them. We're not there yet. We definitely do have some seasonal employees, but we work hard to work with programs like the Canada Summer Jobs Program, where we find people who are looking for part-time summer work, as opposed to putting people in a position where they're waiting on their next contract. And that answers your question about like why do we have our social enterprise? Why are we looking for consistent access to funds, so that we can have that kind of continuity? Because that isn't the kind of thing you can fill out a grant for, unfortunately. We hope one day it will be, but nobody wants to just pay staff salaries or pay rent for our building so that we don't have to lay people off in the winter. People want to pay for the beautiful farms and the warehouse, the active warehouse going, but that's not how it is all the time. And we want to make sure people don't lose out. And so it's about following through on your values when it looks cool and exciting and pretty, and when it doesn't. How do people find FoodShare is a good question, and also how do people find food? Just jumping back to the fact that we other than the fact that we jumped in out of a real sense of, no one else was going to do it during the heart of the pandemic, we are not a food aid organization. We don't provide food directly to community. And so in terms of looking for us when they're looking for food, that's not something that that's not something that we advertise, and that's something that we hope won't happen, because we don't want to have to let folks down. We're not able to consistently provide free food to the community. Instead, we're always working on advocacy initiatives, including trying to change government policy, thinking about things like improving the minimum wage, thinking about things like universal basic income, thinking about increasing the Ontario Disability Support Program, increasing the amount that we're spending on social assistance so that nobody is in a position, hopefully in a few years, where we need food banks, where we need people to be looking for food, where they can actually have the cash in hand to go out and buy the food they need. And you might go home and you might talk to some people in your lives about this, and they might think that's quite a remarkable way of looking at it, or quite impossible, or they might think that food banks are just a part of society, but they're actually not. They've only been around in Canada since the 80s. So it's, 1980 was the first time a food bank opened in Canada. So really thinking about the fact that we're putting people in our neighbors, our friends, in a position where they have to, depend on these systems to get the food that they need, when in reality, we ought to be fighting for policy that, gives them the power and the cash to do what they need. In terms of finding us for other things, for cooking classes and everything else, and making sure that they continue to remain a part of our community, we mostly do that by not doing the vast majority of our outreach as FoodShare, but working in conglomeration, working in connection with all those little community groups, so that when it comes time to do a cooking class, we've got the community center in Rexdale, and the community center at Jane and Finch, and the community center in West Scarborough at the Boys and Girls Club, and they've already got a long list of people who are looking to take a cooking class. So we don't always have to kind of blast it out and put it to the world and take somebody who's never heard of us and make them part of our community. We already have that kind of, people are already in the fold, if you will. They're already, kind of vaguely part of the FoodShare community, and we get to bring them in tighter and say, let's hang out and let's be friends.
Thank you so much for sharing about FoodShare with us, because we know that Andrea is working at FoodShare. It's another organization, but your schools are organizations, your own communities. And what you're thinking about right now is, how do you help your school do the kinds of things, not necessarily about food, but about community? Though food is a part of community, you're welcome to think about food through this challenge. But you want to really be thinking about, how do you build your school to be a place that continues to move like the community you want it to move? How do you make sure that who you want your community, your school community to be, is who you are? And I hope that what you heard from Andrea today is so much about how we need to say, this is who we want to be, and then what actions do we take so that we can be that? It's not as easy as saying we want to be this. We have to say we want to be it, and then we have to take the actions. Sometimes those actions are things that we can directly take. Sometimes it's things we have to ask other people to take, because we can't do everything. And as you're exploring your challenge, you'll see, as you look at these opposing models, right? What can different people lead? What different decisions can we make? And where do we take action? Where do we need each other to take action? And so we hope that in spending your time with Andrea today, you're starting to think about, what are our values? What do we care about? And then how do we live that? How do we bring that to life in our school community? And so to end our time together, I want to do two things. I want to say thank you so, so much to Andrea. It was such a joy to have you, to spend our afternoon with you, to learn from you, to have you get our brains going and thinking. And just a heartfelt thank you from all of us to you for your time and your insights and your ideas. And they're going to affect how we think about our work in making sure our school communities are a place that everyone belongs and everyone is affirmed. And so a heartfelt thank you from us. And then to all of our friends, as we wrap up our time together, I want you to go back to that piece of paper you had at the very beginning, right? We asked you to divide it into 3. And in each one, you put one value that you had. That's something that was important to you. And what I would like you to do is, for each one, what's one action that you take to show that this is one of your values? So if you value laughter, if you value that people are funny, how do you help do that? How do you crack jokes? How do you do funny things? Or if you value family, right, or friends, what actions do you take to show them that they are important to you? And so this is how we're going to end our time together, is having you come back to your sheet of paper and think about the values that you have and how you show that those values matter to you. So I'm going to put myself on mute. We're going to keep this up for 5 more minutes so you can sit down and think about this. We're going to say bye to our friend Andrea and say thank you very, very much. It was so lovely to have you. And to everybody, have a wonderful time right now thinking about what actions do you take to show what values you have. So like I said, I'm going to put myself on mute and give you time in your class to go back to your sheet of paper and show that you take actions to show that those are values that you have. Folks, it was so wonderful to spend time with you today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. They were so interesting. I'm so grateful that you thought of them, that you asked them, and now that you're thinking about your values. We wish you a wonderful rest of the day, a wonderful rest of the week, and we cannot wait to see all your thinking and the wonderful things that you do and your great ideas. So have a wonderful day, and we will see you soon. Bye, everyone.